As the war in the Middle East develops, Prime Minister Mark Carney continues to expand and elaborate on Canada's position on the conflict. His first remarks on the war came last Saturday.
Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. And the Canadian government urges the protection of all civilians in this conflict going forward.
Yesterday, Carney furthered that position, saying again that Canada supports the efforts to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, but that it does so with regret.
We do, however, take this position with regret because the current conflict is another example of the failure of the international order. We took a position because we view the nuclear threat and the export of terrorism of Iran over decades as one of the gravest threats to international peace and security. In that limited sense, we supported that aspect. That is not a blank check. That is not us participating. That is not us asking for something in exchange for that. None of that's true. That is just a straight-up position.
Now, today, while again repeating Canada's initial position, Carney spoke about the possibilities for de-escalation and the potential inconsistencies with international law.
The action that was taken, we weren't consulted on it. It would appear prima facie not to be consistent or to be inconsistent with international law. It's a judgment for others to make. I'm not a lawyer, let alone an international legal expert. As the situation is now, with the expansion, I have to say, a predictable expansion of the conflict, there is first and foremost an importance to re-emphasize the rules of international engagement. There are a large number of countries now that are being attacked, and they are only defending, and that is admirable. It creates a possibility for a de-escalation, but certainly not a certainty, and we're encouraging that to happen.
The Power Panel is here. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist. Rob Benzie is the Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. And here with me in studios, Tim Powers worked as a strategist for Conservative parties, and Jordan Likeness is a former NDP strategist. Tim, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Katie.
What do you make of the evolution of what we just sort of heard there?
It's an evolution's the right way to describe it. Look, I think actually Lawrence Martin, sorry, Rob, I'm sure Rob would have written something as brilliant as Lawrence Martin did today, talked about how, the prime ministers get to find how they position themselves as it relates to U.S. military action. And as he rightly outlined, we all remember how Mr. Chrétien differentiated himself and still does in his 92nd or 93rd year from George W. Bush and the war in Iraq and the actions around all of that. I think the Prime Minister's initial reaction was probably a very human reaction, but then there seems to be a bit of a course correction, which is more in line with Canada. It comes across as clumsy, probably not what he wanted to do this week. Well, when you look at the domestic political context, because Pierre Poilievre is overseas as well, trying to brandish his foreign credentials, not super helpful to him. I don't know if it'll be materially damaging over time, but when you take 3 to 4 sentences to explain where you actually stand on it, you have a little bit of trouble.
Amanda, the initial argument that the Prime Minister seemed to lay out is that, he wants the outcome of ensuring that Iran never has a nuclear weapon, but he didn't. At first, it seemed he was supportive of the action, and now he's sort of saying, well, we support the outcome, but hey, we do acknowledge that this might not be consistent with international law. How do those things sort of all work together?
Well, I see it as those were 3 different answers to 3 different questions, 3 different moments, right, of a rapidly escalating and evolving conflict. And the first was about the threat that Iran poses. The second was about the legality of the military action. And the third was about Canada's role in the conflict. I don't see them as contradictory. I think he's been actually pretty clear on those points. You can say that you support the idea of preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. You can clearly state that Iran poses their nuclear ambitions pose a serious global threat. And you can say that any military action should be done under the lens of international law, respecting international law, and de-escalation, which is a long-held Canadian position. So, no, I actually don't see it as contradictory. I think you can hold those two truths at the same time. You can talk about this incredible threat, the nuclear threat, and you can talk about respecting military action. And to me, that's not contradiction. That's actually responsible diplomacy.
Jordan?
I admire Amanda's flexibility in reaching to reconcile those positions. I mean, look, I think it's a change in position, that's for sure. And I guess, maybe a point in Prime Minister Carney's court. He's not the only one. President Emmanuel Macron in France also shifted his position this week closer to that of Spain's President Pedro Sanchez, who's very critical of the U.S. Attack. And look, I think the question really here is, and what has put the Prime Minister in a difficult situation, is that he endorsed the U.S. action in the absence of a lot of the things that we would traditionally look for before a Canadian government would be supportive of this type of action. So there's no broad global coalition that's in support of this. This is the United States acting alone with Israel only. We haven't had a big parliamentary discussion or a public discussion here in Canada to show that there's public support for this kind of a mission or even a sort of serious engagement around that. All the public opinion polling that we see suggests that it's relatively unpopular, actually both in the US as well as in Canada. We don't have a clear set of evidence that there was a reason to do this when it was done. The United States still hasn't produced what evidence that they used to make the decision about making the strikes happen right now versus at a different time. And lastly, it's not clear what the goal of the attack was. Regime change may come out of this, but that's not a guarantee. Of course, the Iranian regime is very entrenched. And even though some leadership has been taken out, there remain other players, including the IGRC, who may take control, who are also very bad people. The opposition is not unified within Iran. It is a really long stretch to say that we could guarantee that a liberal democracy is going to come out of this. And in fact, it's probably, unfortunately, a pretty unlikely outcome. And then lastly, there's not a clear exit strategy. We don't know where this is going to end. The president has talked about weeks now of potential engagement and attacks. And of course, the conflict has also now broadened to involve around 17 other countries. So these are all things that typically a Canadian government would look at and would weigh before endorsing such an action, particularly as it does go against international law. But Prime Minister Carney was very quick to come out and endorse, and I think he's been feeling the heat on it.
Rob, what do you make of it?
I think, Katie, that, I mean, fair enough. The Prime Minister's position has evolved, let's be charitable and say that. But I'm not sure I buy that this is necessarily unpopular in Canada. We had 350,000 people, the biggest demonstration in the history of Toronto, a couple of weeks ago on a very cold Saturday, people in support of regime change. On this last Saturday, when the bombs were flying, there were 50,000 people on the streets of Toronto. I was walking by the U.S. consulate on University Avenue the other day. Bouquets of flowers have been left there with "Thank you, President Trump." And look, lots of Canadians don't like President Trump, but even a stopped clock is right twice a day. So I just wonder if this is maybe not as high risk a political thing for the Prime Minister. Yeah, it's causing him a little bit of eruptions within his caucus. You have had some speaking out against that. Understandably, there's no monolith of opinion in any big political party. But I think Carney is kind of learning that on the international stage, things can evolve. He's on a tightrope too, Katie, because you're in Washington. You know how difficult it is to deal with the Trump administration. It's not like him issuing that statement on Saturday is necessarily going to help us in Kuzma negotiations or going to help us, end Trump's tariffs in the short term. But I think it was it was pretty unequivocal. Remember, the IRGC has been designated a terrorist organization by Canada. Stephen Harper closed our embassy in Tehran, 13 years ago or something, 14 years ago. It's not like Iran is not a terrorist state. I mean, it is. And Carney, in his longer answer to my colleague Alex Ballingal's question in Australia, actually said that. He said that the failure of international law includes the fact that Iran has been allowed to export terror for as many years as it has.
But Katie, I agree with what Rob says. I actually think, despite what some of the polling says, there are a lot of Canadians who see what is happening in the takeout of the nuclear options in Iran as a good thing. I think, though, the problem the Prime Minister has, it looks like it's clean up in aisle 3, because it was answer 3 that where he wanted to go in the first place. Had he started with what he said in Davos, I accept the world as it is, not as I want it to be. So I back this. I get there's some problems with international law. He probably wouldn't have spent whatever the last number of days have been trying to fix this up. It probably also would have brought some comfort to, people in his caucus, like, is it Mr. Greaves or Mr. Reeves in Victoria?
Greaves, yeah.
I don't know if it would have satisfied Mr. Axworthy, who has a voice which people respect and listen to, but I think Mr. Axworthy could say, all right, I get aspects of that, I still don't agree. But the forceful, I'm with you, probably rubbed some people the wrong way, even though it, I think, was the right course of action, that in this case, that clock being right twice a day got it right.
Amanda, do you think that, some of the backlash that we've heard from people like the Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy, from Will Greaves, a Liberal MP, that sort of factored into Carney getting to where he is now?
I don't know if that did, or the fact that it's just evolving. Like where Trump started on day one, and his position on it will be days has turned to weeks, to turn to potential months. And I think as the situation evolves, so too does our position. So too does the explanation of where Canada sees itself. Like, I know we're used to operating in these simple slogans, but that's not true diplomacy. I mean, this is a complicated, complex, nuanced situation that is evolving rapidly. And so too should the Prime Minister's stance. I don't think his position has changed so much since day one. Day one, he said, Iran is a threat. We support the idea of preventing them and their nuclear ambitions. Day 3, that's still true, but also you need to respect international law. But also we should be working toward de-escalation. I'm still I know it's unpopular, but I'm still failing to see the contradiction here.
Jordan, do you have any or do you think that Mark Carney should have any concern that, even though it is very largely established how horrific the Iranian regime was, the murder of citizens in the streets, the long repression of its population, and all of the horrific things that the people of that country have endured, with that sort of in one part of this context, is there a risk for the Prime Minister if he's seen as too close to Trump, if this ends up being a long, prolonged, or a drawn-out conflict?
Yeah. No, and I think you're absolutely right to name how terrible the regime is and was, and the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Iranian people, I think, are what the Prime Minister also has been talking about, needing to come to the fore and be the ultimately kind of victorious here. But the problem is there's a very long distance between what's happening now and that outcome. And I think that is where some of the political danger lies for the Prime Minister. There's no question that there was very strong support for this military action within the Persian and the Iranian Canadian community here in Canada and abroad. And that is part of the long struggle against a very repressive regime. But the danger in the vacuum is that there are also other outcomes that could be very troubling. America doesn't really have a great track record when it comes to regime change in the Middle East. We can think about Iraq, we can think about Libya, we can think, of course, about Afghanistan as well. This is very complicated stuff. And when we are now seeing it go out into a broader conflict, that also increases the chance that Canada may be asked to in some way participate at some point in facilitating some aspect of this military mission. And that's where we've seen already the president put significant pressure on UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer about using some UK territory as a base of operations for this. We could perhaps see something similar happen down the road to Canada. And those questions can become very politically thorny for the Prime Minister.
And on that point, Rob, we've also seen the way that Donald Trump has spoken about Keir Starmer, the way that he's spoken about Spain and made threats to end trade with Spain. What kind of risks does that add to, the Canadian government when it tries to sort of navigate what steps to take next, when you have to factor in the threats of Donald Trump, who, when he doesn't get what he wants, he will lash out and punish?
Yeah, I guess it's a risk. But Katie, I mean, you know that the president's attention span is rather limited. And I mean, it's not that long ago that we were all talking about Greenland and the annexation of that. And I think that unfortunately, when the American casualties begin to mount, and you live in the United States, you know that the military is taken very, very seriously there and respected greatly. And when you have body bags coming into Dover, Delaware, Americans don't like to see that on television, and they sure feel strongly about that. And I think right now they're kind of in they're in the, I guess, the honeymoon phase of war, when it's still shiny and new, and they think that they're winning, but I mean. And we talk about Carney's evolving position. Pete Hegseth's evolving position, the Secretary of Defense, who calls himself the Secretary of War, even though Congress hasn't changed the name officially, his position has evolved during press conferences on the same day. So I think the situation's really fluid, and I think. Could there be some backlash toward Canada the way that we've seen with Spain? I guess there could be, but I mean, Trump's jibe about Keir Starmer saying he's no Winston Churchill. Well, I mean, it's playing big in the UK press. I was reading in the Times this morning about that, and the Daily Telegraph are having great fun with it. But Donald Trump is no Franklin Roosevelt, so these are the times that we are in. So it's a fun insult, but you know what Trump's like better than we do, Katie.
Well, a couple of things I will say. I think that Trump is, even though at times he does get distracted and oftentimes he's influenced by the last person to sort of talk to him in the room, he does hold a grudge, and he does like to poke the bear. And if we take a look at what sort of happened with Justin Trudeau over the final months of his time as Prime Minister, that's one thing. But the other thing that I would point out is that Donald Trump campaigned on being a president who is not going to get involved in foreign conflicts. And he promised that him and J.D. Vance, when they were out on the campaign trail, they accused of Kamala Harris of accusing her of getting your children sort of involved in these foreign entanglements. And when I go out and interview people in America. Just recently, I was in North Carolina. I interviewed this one gentleman, and he was wearing a Trump hat. We met him outside a polling station, and he started talking to me about, and he legitimately meant it. He was not making any sort of joke or being facetious, but he's like, I truly believe that we would be dead if Kamala Harris had been elected president, because from his position, he thought that she would get America entangled in foreign wars. And when Donald Trump made that promise that he was not going to get American military involved in these sort of foreign conflicts, they believed him and they support him. And there's another element in there of Americans who don't want to see American tax dollars go to foreign conflicts. And that is something that I think that as we go forward on this, and as you know, the Trump administration has not clearly outlined what its goals are, as you guys have all said, they are constantly evolving. I think that possibly that might be sort of by design, because if the goalposts are always shifting, how can you hold down someone to whether it's a success or not, right? It just, everything's moving around. Nothing is solid, or there's no clear sort of objective here. And so that way, Donald Trump at any point in time can declare a victory any way he wants, and it's to his benefit. And apparently I've now become a power panelist rather than the moderator of this panel. I've decided, let me tell you about a America. But those are the sort of experiences that, American voters that support Donald Trump, and they are, his base of support remains there. I know that the polls suggest right now that he's not doing very well, and that those numbers may come down. But in my experience in traveling across the United States, when you go into those Trump places, even though people are paying more for money because of tariffs, they say, listen, I know that I'm going to have a harder time right now, but Donald Trump has promised that this is going to mean more factory jobs for my kids in the future. Whether that turns out or not, that is obviously the big question, but they believe him. And so even though this is unpopular, even though it's an election midterm year, that'll really be the first test of this, but it's going to be, we're going to have to wait and see, and that's just basically this sort of moment in a nutshell. But Prime Minister Mark Carney has pulled back the curtain. I'll move back into moderation role. No, they'll be like, this is my experience covering politics in America. But Mark Carney...
We're here for you, Katie. We're here for your therapy.
Honestly,
let it out. Let it
honestly,
out
we could just have a moment about all of the things.
Space.
There you go. No space is a safe space. Prime Minister Mark Carney has pulled back the curtain on his approach to dealing with U.S. President Donald Trump. Carney was asked about his game plan for managing that relationship.
Respect, but not obsequiousness. He's president for a reason. He's eminently, elected twice. You would say elected 3 times. He appreciates, particularly in private, being direct and discussing issues and being clear where your position is. You don't want to say anything in public that you can't back up. Be careful in terms of the language that you use with him, but in a way that's consistent with what you really think. He is more interested in your viewpoint on various things in private, and that creates an ability to work through things. But it's not easy, to be clear. It's not easy.
Rob, I'm going to start with you. What do you make of what the Prime Minister revealed there?
I thought that was a really interesting exchange, Katie. It reminded me of things that I've seen California Governor Gavin Newsom say about his private interactions with Trump. And he's, basically the leader of the opposition, it seems, these days, as a potential presidential candidate for the Democrats in 2028. But Newsom says he privately has, pretty constructive exchanges with Mr. Trump, and I think that's what Mr. Carney said in Australia is that's a fair comment, and I think it's a really astute observation. I thought that was a really interesting part of his discussion, also talking about dealing with Xi in China. What was not as was maybe a little more cringy was their discussion, him reminiscing about being a central bank governor, and them talking about the wines at the 7-course dinners when they were talking about the world economy. I know he was trying to say how absurd this was, but I didn't think it came across that great. It was, if I were Pierre Poilievre, I'd be like clipping and saving that for a campaign ad.
Amanda, what do you make of it?
I'm still on obsequiousness, which I'm like, can everyone use that in a sentence? That is the challenge going forward. I thought it was pretty fascinating, actually, because, and in some ways, maybe somewhat predictable, because I think that everyone has this idea that, Trump is one way. He has a public persona. It's kind of like his reality TV hangover, and that behind the scenes, there may be opportunities that don't exist publicly. So 2 things that made a lot of sense to me. If you're going to say something publicly, especially if you're going to embarrass the president or if you're going to put him on the back burner in some way, that can come and bite you. And we've seen that, right? We saw it with the Doug Ford ads. At the same time, this idea that there might be more of an exchange opportunity, a give and take, a desire to hear the other perspective, all of that is illuminating, but it also maybe gives us this glimmer of hope that the Prime Minister might be able to find that dance with him in the room.
Before I ask both Jordan and Tim, one thing I'm going to say is I'm going to keep an eye on the clock at 6 o'clock Eastern time. Anita Anand is expected to give a news conference talking about the efforts that the Canadian government is undergoing right now to try and help get Canadians who are in the Middle East right now to safety and get them out of the region. So if I interrupt anyone, I'm not trying to be rude or cut off your time. We do have to go to that.
So it's not the support group for reporters covering
No, that's not what's next.
That means down the hall.
Exactly, and there's a lot of alcohol down at that meeting down the hall.
Like the central bankers.
But not the good one.
No, not the good one. No, we're having like the malt liquor. We're very sad. Tim, what do you make of what we learned from this sort of more candid exchange about what it's like to deal with Donald Trump?
I think, well, what was missing, of course, if you go back and think of Vladimir Zelensky, and you covered that when he first was there, dress appropriately. Because that president also pays a lot of attention to all of that. I don't think there's a hell of a lot of there that is surprising, probably to this audience and the people that you speak to, Katie, because that seems to be true. The Prime Minister smartly didn't add it, but I think pandering helps from time to time, as we have seen when it comes to Donald Trump. And Prime Minister did that early on, and it seemed to have some effect, though did not play well here in Canada. I think the takeaway maybe, and I don't know if that was what Mark Carney was trying to set himself up for, is I'm the guy who can solve a lot of your problems, because he's trying to drive this initiative in Europe, and you heard Michael Chong talk about, well, maybe Carney should use that to bring about diplomatic resolution to Iran. I think he's using it as an opportunity to showcase the role Canada can play, even with the most difficult trading relationship partner we've ever had when it comes to the United States.
Jordan?
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting discussion, though. And I would echo what Rob said about the wine comments. I think that the Prime Minister has a great personality sometimes when he's in those moments, and you really see a side of him that is not always present in his media availabilities. But there's kind of a danger to that too if he feels maybe a little too comfortable with the audience. So I liked the personality, but I think keeping his anecdotes grounded in the future is probably some sound advice for him. But I thought what really came away for me from that conversation was just the degree to which and the carefulness with which he clearly weighs every word, every thing that has to do with the United States and with the president in his comments in every forum. And I thought that actually, lent a little bit of context to the speed at which we saw his statement in support for the attacks on Iran. Because Canada was out very quickly and very strongly in support. And I think seeing that interaction, as Tim said, it does underline a lot of things we already know about the relationship with the president, but it really does underline how everything is through that lens of how that's going to be seen by the president, interpreted by the president, and how it will impact Canada's chances as we go into the renegotiation. And I think lastly, on the question of Canada's diplomatic presence and what role we could play in negotiating, this is an interesting challenge because the Prime Minister has really captured the world's attention with his Davos speech. But at the same time, at home, he has just passed a budget where we are going to be significantly cutting our diplomatic capacity in the Department of Foreign Affairs. At a certain point, these two things are not complementary. And I think that he would rightly be pressed on how much capacity we actually have to deliver on some of the things he's talking about in terms of middle powers.
Some of the comments that he made in that, it corroborated some of the reporting we've done here on CBC News, that after talking to sources, and I've reported this previously, one thing that I've been told is consistent is that Donald Trump, when he's in a room with he's having one-on-one conversations with world leaders, he does like to ask them what their opinion is on different sort of world conflicts, particularly I know that Iran is one that has come up many times, and he is looking for sort of input in other sort of viewpoints when it comes to these other kinds of things. And to your point, Jordan, about just how much time and thought and energy and how it reveals just how you have to be careful with every single word you use. It is my understanding, according to sources, that do you guys remember when Carney sat down with Trump in the Oval Office, that first meeting, and he said that, that President Trump, his presidency has been transformative. Right. And transformative is one of those words where it can mean anything you want it to mean. And you can take anything you want away from it. Well, it is my understanding, according to sources, that it was actually Kirsten Hillman that presented that word to the Prime Minister. Everything is, the final decision is always up to the Prime Minister, is my understanding, when it comes to these kinds of interactions. But there was prep work done. There was, and which you would expect, that kind of thing. But it's my understanding that word was thought about, that word was discussed, and ultimately that word was chosen, and it stood out as one of those things because obviously it can mean whatever you want it to mean.
Well, and you can think about the work that went into, for example, choosing in that meeting how they were going to respond to the 51st state, the sort of gentle rebuke that some properties are not for sale, which, was a really deft play on Trump's background in real estate. So these are things that are really very carefully weighed and thought of ahead of time, and I think that was really reflected in the Prime Minister's comments.
Tim, going forward, we're in this moment where, dealing with what's going on in the Middle East, Canada is trying to navigate a path on where to stand in this moment as this continues to evolve. Mark Carney is trying to manage this relationship with Donald Trump as, this existential threat over existential questions about Canada's relationship with the United States, especially when it comes to trade. What do you think, if you were going to give the Prime Minister some advice, what kinds of things do you think he needs to keep in mind, or should he at least keep in mind as he's trying to navigate, this massive conflict in the Middle East, that this war that there are no signs is going to ease up anytime soon. And at the same time, you're trying to sort of take a position there and manage this relationship. What would you sort of advise to him to keep in mind?
Know when you're on a two-lane highway and know when you're on a dead-end road. And I think that's something that other leaders have known very well. And the thing with Iran, where it can be a two-lane highway, is in the cleanup. There is no way Canada can touch it from a military engagement perspective, but there is the classic Canadian. Go back to the hostage situation in 1979, 1980. Who brokered the solution? Ken Taylor, the late Ken Taylor. Canada has a history here. So embrace it, use it where you can to be the broker. Mark Carney seems ideally suited to that role. Trump seems to have some trust in him. And on the broader issues as it relates to Canada's foreign policy, use the moment that it's here too. Look at what Tim Hodgson was saying the other day, the energy minister. Well, the world wants our energy. Now is the time to use that and use the influence that comes with that to elevate both our economic perspectives and our global reputation.
Rob, what do you make of that?
No, I think Tim makes a very good point. I mean, I also, on a more crass level, I wonder, what does this do for Canadian unity? Because Alberta oil, if oil's $130 a barrel, that's a lot. That's going to shut up a lot of Alberta separatists. They're going to be, piped down because they'll be too busy counting money. So, I mean, there are all of these other geopolitical things going on that are more mundane. Obviously, Canada is not going to be asked to send troops to the region. I just don't think we don't have the capacity, and I don't think America doesn't want its own boots on the ground. They want to just do an air attack, and aerial bombardments, we know from history, have never resulted in regime change. So at some point they either lose interest or they declare victory and do a mission accomplished thing like George W. Bush did on an aircraft carrier, and then leave it. But I think it's the problem is I just don't get the sense that President Trump had a day two, a day three strategy. I think they knew what they wanted to do the first day, and I don't think they had a clue what they were going to do in the next 2-3 days. And as I said earlier, Katie, if once the casualties start mounting, that is going to change public opinion even further in the United States. Mr. Trump is not popular. He's at 36% approval rating. The midterms, as you know, will be potentially unkind to his party, to the Republicans. So the Democrats could rein him in Congress. Do impeachment proceedings start? Do members of his cabinet start getting impeached? I mean, there are all of these domestic political headaches hanging over. And as you said, Katie, there is a huge isolationist wing of the MAGA movement, right? And they don't want Americans to be entangled in foreign wars. They don't want 20-year-old kids from Iowa coming home in body bags, as we have already seen.